We've been told that having $1 million should feel like security. But when you look closer, it doesn't fully hold up, because the number sounds complete, almost like a finish line you were supposed to reach. And yet many retirees quietly arrive there and still feel a low, persistent anxiety. Not panic, not crisis, just a subtle sense that something doesn't add up. Especially in the United States, where $1 million used to mean wealth. Today, it often just means you've bought yourself time, not certainty. And that distinction matters more than most people realize. Because retirement is not a moment, it's a long stretch of unknowns, often lasting 20, 30, even 40 years, depending on your health. So the question quietly shifts from how much do I have to something more uncomfortable. How long will it last? And that's where the feeling of being poor begins to creep in. Not because you are actually poor, but because your money now has a job, a very demanding job that doesn't come with guarantees. If you're someone who planned carefully, saved consistently, and avoided debt, this feeling can be even more confusing, almost unfair, because you did everything you were told to do. You followed the rules, trusted the math, delayed gratification. And still, the result feels emotionally underwhelming. So let's slow this down gently, because there's logic underneath the feeling. There are generally two groups of people who reach retirement with $1 million. The first group feels fear almost immediately after retiring. The second group feels calm at first, then uneasy over time. They trust the system until small uncertainties begin stacking quietly. Both reactions are valid, and both come from the same hidden reality. $1 million is not income. It's a resource that must be managed carefully. And when you convert it into monthly income, the number feels very different. Using a conservative withdrawal rate, it might give you around $40,000 per year, before taxes, before unexpected costs, before inflation slowly erodes it. Which means your millionaire life may feel surprisingly ordinary, especially in cities where healthcare, housing, and daily life keep getting more expensive. This is where perception quietly breaks away from reality. Because on paper, you are financially successful. But in daily life, you still need to budget, plan, and sometimes restrict yourself. And that gap creates emotional friction that's hard to explain to others. It's not about luxury, it's about stability over time. And stability, when stretched across decades, becomes fragile in subtle ways. Especially when markets fluctuate and your portfolio doesn't grow evenly. Some years feel generous, others feel quietly threatening. And you begin adjusting your lifestyle without even realizing it. Skipping trips, delaying purchases, becoming more cautious with everyday spending. Not because you have to immediately, but because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. This is the psychological weight that numbers alone don't capture. Money in retirement is not just math, it's also emotion and perception. And when those don't align, even a large number can feel insufficient. So if you've ever wondered why $1 million doesn't feel like enough, you're not misunderstanding the situation, you're actually seeing it more clearly. Because the real issue isn't the number itself, it's how that number behaves over time under real life conditions. So let's gently unpack what $1 million actually represents in retirement, because the meaning changes depending on how you use it over time. At its core, this number is not wealth anymore. It's a stream of income. And that stream depends heavily on how fast you allow it to flow. This is where the idea of a safe withdrawal rate quietly enters the conversation. Many financial planners reference something close to 4% annually, which means withdrawing $40,000 from $1 million each year. But even that number isn't fixed. It's more like a cautious guideline, because markets don't move in straight lines, and neither does life. Some years will support that withdrawal comfortably, others will quietly resist it. And over time, those small differences begin to compound emotionally. Let's pause here and acknowledge something that often goes unsaid. $40,000 a year might sound manageable at first glance, but once you layer in healthcare, housing, and daily living, it tightens quickly, especially if you're living in a higher cost area within the United States. And even more so if unexpected expenses begin appearing over time. This is where the fear-based group starts to feel validated, because their caution begins to reflect real-world constraints. But for the data-driven group, This is where the shift begins. They start revisiting assumptions they once felt confident about. And that quiet recalibration can feel unsettling over time. Now let's break this down a bit more clearly using simple proportions. Imagine your retirement spending divided into 3 broad categories. Roughly 50% goes toward essential living expenses, things like housing, food, utilities, and basic healthcare coverage. Another 30% often goes toward variable lifestyle choices, travel, hobbies, family support, and small comforts that bring meaning. And the remaining 20% quietly absorbs the unexpected. Medical surprises, home repairs, or helping someone you love. On paper, this distribution looks balanced and reasonable. But in reality, those categories don't stay neatly separated. Unexpected costs tend to leak into every other category over time. And that's where the pressure slowly begins to build. Because when one area expands, another must quietly contract. Often it's the lifestyle portion that gets reduced first. Trips, not dramatically, just gradually enough that you barely notice at first. Until one day, your life feels smaller than you expected. And that feeling can be difficult to articulate to others. Because from the outside, everything still looks stable. You're not struggling, you're not in crisis, you're simply adjusting. But internally, it can feel like a quiet form of limitation. This is because most conversations stop at reaching the number. They don't fully explore what it feels like to live on it. And that's why this experience can feel isolating at times. You achieved something meaningful, yet the emotional reward feels incomplete. So the question gently becomes, what's missing from the equation? Because the numbers are not wrong, but they are also not the full story. And understanding that gap is where clarity slowly begins. What's missing is not just more money, but a clearer understanding of risk over time. Because retirement doesn't fail all at once. It drifts slowly off balance. And that drift often begins with something called sequence of returns risk. It sounds technical, but the idea is surprisingly simple. If the market drops early in your retirement, your withdrawals do more damage. Because you're selling assets when their value is temporarily lower, and those losses don't fully recover once the money has been withdrawn. So even if the market improves later, your base has already shrunk. This creates a quiet but powerful form of long-term pressure, and it explains why 2 identical portfolios can produce very different outcomes, simply based on when the downturn happens in your timeline. Now let's layer in another reality that's harder to predict. Inflation doesn't just raise prices, it reshapes your expectations. Things you once considered affordable slowly move out of reach, and the adjustment rarely happens all at once. It's gradual, almost polite, until it becomes impossible to ignore. A few dollars more here, a few dollars more there, until your original plan quietly loses alignment with reality. This is where the data-driven mind starts recalculating constantly, running scenarios, adjusting spending, watching the numbers more closely. And while that vigilance is rational, it can also become exhausting, because you're no longer just living, you're continuously optimizing. Now let's pause again, because this is an important emotional moment. Feeling poor here is not about actual scarcity. It's about the loss of flexibility you expected money to provide. You thought the number would remove constraints, not redefine them. But instead, it introduces a different kind of discipline, one that feels quieter, but also more permanent. This is where psychology begins to shape financial reality, because perception influences behavior, and behavior affects outcomes. Some retirees respond by becoming extremely conservative, spending less than they safely could just to avoid uncertainty. Others respond by maintaining their lifestyle and hoping for stability. Both approaches carry trade-offs that aren't immediately obvious. Overspending increases risk later, underspending reduces quality of life now. And finding the balance between those is deeply personal. There is no single number that solves this completely. Only a range of decisions that evolve over time. So if you feel tension, even with a large portfolio, it may not be a failure of planning, but a reflection of reality. Because retirement is less about reaching a number and more about managing uncertainty with clarity and intention. And that clarity takes time to build, even after you retire. Which is why this phase often feels more complex than expected. Not harder, just less predictable than the accumulation years. Because before retirement, you were adding to the system. Now you are carefully drawing from it while it continues to change. And that shift requires a different mindset entirely, one that blends patience, awareness, and emotional resilience. And that's where the next layer of understanding begins to unfold. The next layer is something many retirees don't expect at all. It's not about money running out, but about purpose quietly fading. Because for decades, your life had structure built around earning and saving. There was a rhythm, a reason, a measurable sense of progress. And then one day, that structure simply disappears. What replaces it is freedom, but also a surprising amount of space. And space, if not filled intentionally, can feel like emptiness. This is where financial discomfort can blend with emotional uncertainty. Because spending money now feels less justified without a clear purpose. You begin questioning even small decisions more than before. Not because you can't afford them, but because they feel less anchored. This creates a subtle loop between money and meaning, where uncertainty in one area amplifies hesitation in the other. Let's gently clarify something important here. This experience is far more common than people openly admit. Because on the surface, everything still looks successful and stable. But internally, there's a quiet adjustment happening every single day. Now, if we look at this from a data perspective again, retirement satisfaction often doesn't increase proportionally with net worth. Beyond a certain point, other factors begin to matter more. Health, relationships, daily routine, and a sense of usefulness. And when those feel uncertain, money alone cannot compensate. So even with $1 million, something can still feel incomplete. Not missing, just not fully aligned with what you expected. This is where many people quietly redefine what rich actually means. It shifts from a number to a feeling of stability and choice. And that feeling is influenced by more than just financial assets. It includes how confident you feel navigating uncertainty, how connected you feel to people around you, and how meaningful your days feel without external pressure. Now let's pause again, because this is where relief can begin. If you feel poor, despite having a strong financial base, it may not be a sign that you've failed. It may be a signal that your expectations need updating, not lowering, but adjusting to match real conditions. Because the world your plan was built for may have changed, and adapting to that change is part of the process. This doesn't mean giving up comfort or joy. It means becoming more intentional about how you create them, which leads us to a more empowering perspective, one that focuses less on the total amount and more on how that amount supports your actual life. Because money at this stage is a tool for alignment, not just a measure of success or security. To see it that way, the pressure around the number can start to soften, making space for a different kind of confidence to grow, one that isn't based purely on accumulation anymore, but on understanding, flexibility, and self-trust. And that shift is where retirement begins to feel more stable again. So what does this look like in practice when you begin adjusting your approach? It often starts with reframing how you define financial safety. Instead of asking, "Is this enough forever?" you ask something softer. Is this enough for the next few years with reasonable flexibility? That shift may seem small, but it changes your emotional experience significantly. Because now you're managing in phases, not trying to predict decades perfectly. This reduces the pressure to solve an impossible long-term equation and replaces it with shorter, more manageable decision windows. Next, many retirees begin creating layers of financial support, not just relying on investments, but combining multiple income sources. This might include social security, part-time work, or passive income streams. Even small additional income can reduce withdrawal pressure significantly. And more importantly, it restores a sense of control, because you're no longer fully dependent on one system behaving perfectly. Now let's talk gently about spending, because this is often misunderstood. Spending less is not always the goal. Spending intentionally is. There's a quiet difference between restriction and alignment. Restriction feels like loss. Alignment feels like clarity. And that distinction can reshape your entire retirement experience. For example, you might spend less on things that no longer matter, while allowing yourself more freedom in areas that bring genuine meaning. This creates a sense of abundance, even within a finite budget, because your money is now supporting your values, not just covering costs. Another important adjustment is how you respond to market changes. Instead of reacting emotionally, you begin preparing in advance, holding a cash buffer, adjusting withdrawals, or delaying large expenses. These small strategies create resilience without requiring perfection. And resilience is often more valuable than optimization because it allows you to absorb shocks without losing confidence. Now let's return to the emotional side for a moment. Many people carry an invisible expectation into retirement that reaching a certain number will eliminate financial worry completely. But in reality, it simply transforms the type of worry you experience, from earning uncertainty to longevity and sustainability concerns. And understanding that transition can feel surprisingly relieving because it removes the idea that something has gone wrong. Instead, it shows that you've entered a different phase entirely, one that requires adjustment, not perfection. So if you feel cautious, thoughtful, or even slightly restricted, it may not be a sign of scarcity, but of awareness. And awareness, when used gently, becomes a powerful advantage because it allows you to make decisions with intention rather than fear, which slowly rebuilds a sense of ease over time. Not instantly, but steadily as your confidence grows. And that growing confidence is what begins to replace the feeling of lack, even if the number in your account hasn't changed dramatically. Because the experience of money is shaped as much by mindset as math. And that realization opens the door to a more peaceful relationship with it, one where you're not constantly measuring, but gradually trusting. And that trust is what carries you into the final stage of this shift. The final shift is not about increasing your wealth, but redefining your relationship with it. Because at this stage, the goal is no longer accumulation, but integration. How your money supports your life, rather than how it defines it. And this is where many retirees begin to feel a quiet sense of relief. Not because everything is certain, but because everything feels more understandable. You stop chasing the idea of enough as a fixed number and start seeing it as a flexible, evolving experience. Some years will feel abundant, others may require gentle adjustments, and both can exist without meaning something has gone wrong. This perspective removes the constant pressure to get everything exactly right. Because retirement is not a single decision, it's an ongoing conversation between your needs, your resources, and your changing priorities. Now let's bring this back to that original feeling of being poor. What you're actually feeling may not be lack, but sensitivity to uncertainty, a heightened awareness of how fragile long-term planning can feel. And that awareness, while uncomfortable, is also a form of wisdom. It encourages you to stay engaged with your finances rather than ignoring them. But it doesn't have to dominate your daily experience. Because with time, familiarity reduces fear, and patterns begin to feel more predictable than they once did. You learn how your spending behaves, how markets fluctuate, how you respond. And that learning creates a quiet sense of control. Not perfect control, but enough to feel grounded again. This is where confidence returns. Not from certainty, but from experience. And that confidence slowly replaces the feeling of scarcity, even if your financial situation hasn't dramatically changed, because your interpretation of it has evolved. And interpretation is what shapes emotional reality over time. So instead of asking, why doesn't this feel like enough? You might begin asking a different, more helpful question. How can I use what I have in a way that feels meaningful and steady? And that question shifts the focus from fear to intention, from limitation to possibility within your current reality. Because the truth is, $1 million was never meant to remove all uncertainty. It was meant to give you options, time, and a degree of freedom. And when you begin to see it through that lens, the pressure softens and the experience becomes more balanced. You stop measuring your life only through financial outcomes and start noticing the quality of your days more closely, which is ultimately what retirement was meant to offer you. So if things feel tighter or more uncertain than you expected, it doesn't mean you've miscalculated your entire future. It simply means you're now living inside the reality you once projected. And reality always carries more nuance than any plan can capture. So allow yourself a bit more flexibility, a bit more patience, Because adjusting is not failing, it's part of sustaining. And sustaining is what retirement is truly about. Not perfection, not certainty, but continuity with care. You planned for the future carefully and responsibly, but you're also allowed to live gently and fully in the present.